I knew the trap had worked the moment the quiet morning cracked with a sharp pop and a puff of gray ash drifting above Linda Whitmore's backyard fire pit. The kind of sound that makes an entire HOA freeze mid-coffee. Blinds twitching, sprinklers hissing like they're listening too. I didn't move at first, just stood on my back porch with the cold rail under my palms and the smell of fresh split oak still hanging in the air, because 3 days earlier that exact stack had been 6 feet high and perfectly squared, every log cut, dried, and stacked by my own hands for the coming winter. Now it was half gone, and the missing pieces had somehow reappeared across the fence in her brand-new outdoor fireplace she'd bragged about at the last HOA meeting, calling it premium seasoned hardwood, like it had magically delivered itself. My name is Daniel Carter, and I don't buy firewood. I cut it myself from the fallen cedar and oak along the back acre of my property, split it with a hydraulic splitter I rebuilt from a rusted frame, then stack it in rows so straight they look like brickwork. It's quiet work, the kind that smells like sap and sawdust and keeps you grounded. Out here, on the edge of the subdivision, my place backs up to a narrow strip of trees that the HOA calls community buffer space, even though my survey pins sit 3 feet inside it. I've lived here 4 years, long enough to know every creak of my fence and every sound that doesn't belong. The first log disappeared on a Tuesday morning. I noticed it because the top row slumped slightly, like someone had pulled a book from the middle of a shelf. I figured maybe a raccoon knocked it loose, or wind, or my own memory playing tricks. The second time, the gap was cleaner, 2 pieces gone, bark flakes still on the gravel. By the third morning, I found faint tire tracks curving through the dew, narrow enough for a golf cart, leading straight toward Linda's gate. Linda Whitmore runs the HOA like she's protecting national security, clipboard always tucked under her arm, smile tight enough to cut paper. She'd already warned me twice about unsightly wood storage lowering property values. Even though my stack sits behind a 6-foot cedar fence, she insisted on approving. 2 days after the tracks appeared, she hosted neighbors around her new fire pit, flames glowing orange against polished stone, and I watched from my kitchen window as she tossed in a log with the same split grain I'd cut the weekend before. The smell drifted over, unmistakable, dry oak and cedar resin, my wood burning in her backyard while she laughed about finding free seasoned timber. That's when the idea settled in, quiet and patient. I didn't confront her. I didn't send an email. I just res-tacked what remained, hollowed a few decoy logs so they looked identical from the outside, and placed them right where the top row had been shrinking. The next morning, the gaps were gone again, and Linda's fire pit was already smoking before the sun cleared the rooftops. And when that sharp pop echoed across the cul-de-sac, her confident smile vanished so fast it was almost silent. The smoke drifted sideways across the fence line, thin and harmless, but it carried the unmistakable smell of cedar sap heating too fast, the kind that told me she had already fed the fire with whatever she grabbed before checking what it was. I stayed still, listening to the low murmur of neighbors stepping onto their patios, the metallic clink of a poker against stone, and Linda's voice shifting from confident hostess to confused homeowner in less than a second. 3 days earlier, none of this would have made sense to anyone watching. My woodpile had looked ordinary, just another stack behind a cedar fence at the edge of a quiet subdivision. But to me it was measured down to inches, 5 rows wide, each log cut to 16 inches so they would fit perfectly in my old cast-iron stove when winter dropped below freezing. I split that wood myself on Saturday mornings, the hydraulic ram humming, the smell of fresh oak filling the yard while the rest of the neighborhood slept in. It was routine, predictable, and quiet. That is why the first missing piece bothered me more than it should have. The second confirmed it was not an accident. By the third morning, the pattern was obvious. The top row always changed overnight. The gaps were clean, never collapsed, never scattered. Someone was lifting pieces carefully, not knocking them loose. I checked the fence latch and found it resting just slightly open, not enough to notice unless you touched it. The gravel near the corner showed shallow tracks that curved back toward Linda's property, thin tires, smooth tread, exactly like the golf cart she drove during her evening rule patrols. That same afternoon, she walked past my fence with her clipboard, pausing just long enough to glance at the stack before writing something down. The next day I heard laughter from her backyard, the low crackle of a new fire pit, and the smell drifted over again, dry hardwood, freshly split, not store-bought bundles wrapped in plastic. When I stepped onto my porch, I could see the flames reflecting off polished stone and the exact shape of one of my split pieces resting on the grate. She lifted it with tongs and told her guests she had found a great source of seasoned wood nearby, smiling like she had discovered buried treasure. That was when I stopped thinking about coincidence. I moved slowly after that, counting rows, marking the inside of a few logs with pencil lines only I would recognize, and setting my camera lower so it would catch the corner where the latch opened. The next morning, 2 of the marked pieces were gone, and the footage showed the quiet silhouette of her golf cart rolling up just before sunrise, headlights off, her hand reaching through the fence like she had done it a dozen times. She did not hurry. She did not look around. She just lifted the logs and stacked them in the cart like they belonged to her. By that point, I understood something important. She was not worried about getting caught because she believed nothing would happen even if she was. And that confidence told me the only way to stop it was to let her think she was still getting away with it, at least one more time. By the time the smoke thinned and the neighbors drifted back inside, Linda's fire pit had gone quiet, but the tension lingered like heat radiating off stone, and I stayed on my porch pretending to check my phone while watching her pace in small circles, poking at the remaining logs as if they might explain themselves. The camera mounted under my gutter had already captured everything from the previous dawn, her golf cart rolling in with the soft electric hum, her hand reaching through the fence, her stacking the decoy pieces right on top of the others she had taken earlier. I replayed the footage once more inside my kitchen, the screen glowing against the dark countertop, and paid attention to the details I knew would matter later. She did not hesitate. She did not test the wood. She simply grabbed the top pieces, the same way she had every morning, trusting the pattern she believed she controlled. That confidence was the real turning point. She thought the woodpile was just sitting there, unclaimed in her mind, like extra landscaping material nobody would miss. I stepped outside again and walked along the fence line slowly, measuring the remaining stack with my eyes. 4 rows instead of 6 now. The gravel still showed faint curved tire impressions, dew disturbed in a neat arc leading back toward her gate. Everything about it felt rehearsed, like she had folded the routine into her morning coffee. I remembered the HOA meeting the previous week, her voice bright and practiced while she talked about maintaining community standards, her clipboard tapping lightly against her palm as she mentioned unsightly storage and the importance of shared aesthetics. At the time, I had just nodded, because arguing with Linda Whitmore in a public meeting was like debating a stopwatch. She spoke quickly, wrote faster, and always ended with a reminder about bylaws. But watching her now, standing beside a silent fire pit with neighbors peeking through blinds, I realized the difference between authority on paper and authority in reality. Paper relied on compliance. Reality relied on evidence. I opened the camera app again and marked the timestamps, saving each clip to a separate folder. Her approach, the latch opening, the lift, the cart rolling away. The small details mattered, like the morning sunlight catching the grain of the wood or the way she balanced 3 pieces at once against her hip. I knew I would need all of it later. The breeze shifted and carried the faint smell of warm cedar back toward my yard, and I walked to the remaining stack, tapping one of the untouched logs lightly with my knuckle. Solid. Ordinary. Nothing dramatic. Just wood waiting for winter. That was the point. Everything looked normal until someone assumed it belonged to them. I res-tacked the top row carefully, leaving the hollow pieces gone, making the pile look slightly fuller than it was so the pattern would appear unchanged. Then I stepped back, studying the lines, making sure nothing suggested anything different. The subdivision settled into its usual afternoon quiet, lawn mowers in the distance, a dog barking once and stopping, sprinklers ticking on in sequence. Across the fence, Linda swept ash from her patio, her movements sharper now, less confident, like she was trying to tidy a story before anyone asked questions. I watched her for a moment longer, then went inside, knowing the footage on my phone had already shifted the balance. She believed she had been taking something unnoticed. Now there was a record, and the next time she reached through that fence, it would not be a guess anymore. The neighborhood stayed unusually quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that feels temporary, like everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. And I could sense the shift just by the way curtains moved a little slower and the usual evening dog walkers kept glancing toward Linda's patio. She finished sweeping the last of the ash into a metal bucket, then dragged her chairs back into perfect alignment, resetting the scene like nothing had happened. But the hesitation in her movements told me she was replaying the moment in her head, trying to understand why her carefully staged morning had not gone according to plan. I stayed inside, reviewing the footage again, this time paying attention to timing. She arrived at 6:12 a.m. the previous morning. The day before that, 6:09. Always before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. Always when sprinklers were still running and the cul-de-sac was empty. It was not random. It was routine. That routine meant she would likely return, because people rarely change habits they believe are safe. I walked back out to the woodpile and adjusted the top row again, making the stack look slightly more inviting, leaving the straightest pieces within easy reach. The air smelled faintly of damp grass and warm stone, and the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the fence. Across the yard, Linda stepped outside with her phone, snapping a photo of her fire pit as if documenting something, then typing quickly, likely sending a message to the HOA group thread where she usually posted reminders about mailbox height and lawn edging. A few minutes later, my own phone buzzed with a neighborhood notification. She had written about a minor equipment malfunction during her morning gathering and suggested everyone check their outdoor setups for safety. The tone calm but defensive, like she was trying to control the narrative before anyone else did. I did not respond. Instead, I checked the camera battery, cleaned the lens with a soft cloth, and angled it slightly lower so it captured the latch, the gravel, and the top row all in one frame. The sun dipped behind the houses, and the subdivision shifted into evening mode, porch lights flicking on one by one, the distant hum of an air conditioner starting up, someone grilling 2 houses down. I split a few more logs deliberately, the steady thud echoing just enough to carry, stacking them neatly so the pile looked refreshed. The sound traveled, and I noticed Linda glance over the fence line once, her expression neutral but attentive, like she was evaluating inventory. That confirmed it. She was still interested. The sky turned a deep blue, and the temperature dropped just enough to make the scent of cutwood sharper. I went inside, set my phone beside the bed with the camera app open, and left the back light off so the yard remained dark. Sometime before dawn, the familiar soft electric hum returned, barely audible through the glass, followed by the faint click of the latch shifting. I did not move, just watched the live feed as her silhouette stepped into frame again, reaching toward the top row with the same practiced motion, confident, unhurried, and completely unaware that this time every detail was being recorded from start to finish. Her silhouette moved with the same calm precision as before, reaching over the fence and lifting 2 pieces from the top row, testing neither weight nor texture, just stacking them against her hip as if she had already decided they belonged to her. The live feed glowed softly on my phone, the timestamp ticking forward while the faint hum of her golf cart idled just out of frame. She set the logs into the rear basket, adjusted them so they would not roll, then reached back for one more, the motion practiced and almost casual. I watched the latch fall back into place as she left, the gravel settling behind her tires, and the yard returned to stillness like nothing had happened. By the time the sun crept over the rooftops, the top row showed another clean gap, identical to the previous mornings. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, letting the cool air carry the scent of damp earth and cut wood. Across the fence, Linda was already arranging chairs again, moving with renewed confidence, as if the previous day had been an inconvenience she had already dismissed. She stacked the pieces beside her fire pit carefully, aligning them like decorative accents, and I noticed she had not replaced the earlier ones, meaning most of what she burned now came directly from my yard. A neighbor 2 houses down slowed during his morning walk, glancing at the growing pile, then at my fence, then continued without saying anything. That silent exchange told me others had started noticing the pattern, even if they were not ready to comment. I checked the footage once more, isolating the newest clip, and saved it alongside the others, building a timeline that showed repetition rather than coincidence. The light grew brighter, and the subdivision filled with routine sounds, garage doors lifting, sprinklers shutting off, someone starting a pickup truck. Linda lit her fire pit again, the flame catching slowly, and the smell of warmed oak drifted back toward my porch. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied, unaware that every piece she had taken now existed in a sequence of recordings that matched day after day. I walked along the fence and paused near the latch, examining the scuff marks where her hand had brushed the wood, faint but consistent, like fingerprints made of dust. The woodpile behind me looked smaller now, 4 rows down to 3, the top line still straight but clearly reduced. I split 2 fresh logs deliberately, the steady rhythm echoing across the yard, then stacked them on top, restoring the appearance of abundance. Linda glanced over again, her eyes tracking the movement, and I could almost see the calculation returning. She believed the supply was still steady, still available, still unclaimed. That belief mattered more than anything. I stepped back inside, leaving the camera running, the yard quiet, and the stack arranged exactly where she expected it to be, knowing the pattern had become predictable enough that the next morning would likely follow the same script. Only this time the record was complete, and her confidence had already written the ending before she even reached for the next log. The pattern held for 2 more mornings, the same quiet approach, the same practiced reach, the same neat gaps appearing at the top of the stack, and by then the routine felt almost mechanical, like a clock that wound itself before sunrise. I kept recording, adding each clip to the sequence, lining them up so the repetition became undeniable. The timestamps formed a rhythm, 6:12, 6:10, 6:11, each arrival within minutes of the last, and the footage showed the same posture, the same unhurried confidence, the same assumption that no one was watching. The woodpile had dropped to 3 rows now, and the change was impossible to ignore. Even from across the yard, I could see Linda's attention sharpen whenever I added fresh pieces, her gaze lingering just long enough to confirm supply. That afternoon she hosted another small gathering. Nothing formal, just 2 neighbors and a tray of drinks balanced on her stone ledge, and I heard her mention how convenient it was to have a steady source nearby, her tone light but deliberate. The smell of burning oak drifted over again, warmer now in the late sun, and I noticed she had started stacking the remaining logs under a small metal cover, protecting them like something valuable. That detail mattered. She was not just using the wood. She was storing it. I walked back to my own stack and counted the pieces left, estimating how many mornings remained before the pile looked too small to tempt her. The answer was not many. I split 4 more logs slowly, letting the sound carry, then placed them carefully on top, restoring the clean line she expected. The grain matched the others, the bark still rough, nothing unusual, just more of the same pattern she had already learned. The camera lens caught the late light, and I adjusted it slightly so the entire top row filled the frame. The subdivision settled into evening again, sprinklers clicking on, porch lights glowing, the distant hum of traffic barely audible beyond the trees. Across the fence, Linda checked her stacked supply once more, counting with her eyes, then went inside. I left the yard dark and quiet, the stack untouched, and waited. Before dawn, the familiar hum returned, softer this time, and the latch shifted exactly as before. Her silhouette stepped into frame, reached forward, and lifted the top pieces with the same calm certainty. She did not look around. She did not hesitate. She simply added them to her cart and rolled away, confident that nothing had changed. When the sun rose, another clean gap marked the spot, and across the fence her fire pit came alive again, the flame steady, the smell drifting back across the boundary. I watched from the porch, knowing the sequence was complete now, the pattern fully documented, and the routine so predictable that the next step no longer depended on guessing. She believed the supply would always be there, and that belief was exactly what kept her coming back. By the 7th morning the routine felt inevitable, like watching the same scene repeat with only the clock changing, and I stood behind the kitchen window before sunrise, phone in hand, the live feed already open as the yard waited in complete stillness. The woodpile had been reduced to 2 neat rows now, but I had rebuilt the top line carefully the night before, selecting pieces that looked freshly split and placing them where they would be easiest to reach. The air was cool enough to carry sound, and when the faint electric hum approached, it seemed louder than usual, the quiet whir of her golf cart drifting through the trees before the latch shifted again. She stepped into frame without hesitation, moving directly toward the top row, her posture relaxed, her movements practiced, like she was continuing a habit she no longer questioned. She lifted the first log, balanced it against her hip, then reached for another, stacking them in the rear basket with the same careful alignment she had used all week. The camera captured every motion, the grain of the wood catching the early light, the faint crunch of gravel under her shoes, the latch swinging back after she left. I waited until she disappeared behind her fence before stepping outside, letting the quiet settle again. The top row showed another clean gap, identical to the others, and across the yard her patio lights flicked on as she arranged the new pieces beside the fire pit. The smell of cut oak lingered in the cool air, and I could see her pause, examining the stack briefly, then continue as if nothing had changed. Neighbors began to move through their morning routines, garage doors opening, sprinklers clicking off, and Linda struck a lighter. Near the stone ring, the small flame catching slowly. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied, and added one of the newly taken pieces to the grate. The smoke rose lightly, nothing dramatic, just a thin plume drifting sideways, and she adjusted the log with tongs, nudging it into place. I watched from my porch, hands resting on the rail, as the fire settled into a steady glow. She added another piece, then another, building the small stack she had been repeating each morning. The breeze carried the scent back toward my yard, warm cedar and dry oak mixing with the smell of damp grass. She seemed relaxed again, chatting on her phone, tapping messages while the flames stayed low and controlled. The scene looked ordinary, almost peaceful, but the camera on my phone showed the full sequence already saved. Every approach, every lift, every morning lined up in order. She believed the routine was still hers to control, that the woodpile behind my fence would keep feeding her fire without consequence. I stayed quiet, letting the moment unfold naturally, the smoke thinning as the sun rose higher, the neighborhood settling into another calm morning, and her fire burning steadily with pieces she had taken just minutes earlier, unaware that the entire pattern had now reached the point where nothing else needed to be guessed. The fire burned steadily for several minutes, low and controlled, the kind of calm morning flame that barely draws attention, and Linda leaned back in her chair with her phone in one hand, tapping out messages while the smoke drifted lazily across the fence line. I stayed on my porch, still and quiet, watching the glow settle around the log she had just placed. The neighborhood moved normally around us, a garage door rolling open down the street, a sprinkler clicking off, a dog barking once and then stopping. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just the slow rhythm of another suburban morning. She nudged one of the pieces with her tongs, adjusting it so it caught more evenly, and a faint pop sounded from the fire pit, sharp but harmless, like a dry knot reacting to heat. She paused, glanced down, then shrugged and leaned back again. A second later, another quick pop followed, slightly louder, sending a brief puff of ash upward. That was enough to change her expression. She sat forward, studying the fire, then used the tongs again, shifting the pieces apart as if checking for moisture. The smoke thickened for a moment, then thinned again, drifting sideways in a gray ribbon. 2 houses over, someone stepped onto their driveway and looked toward the sound, then continued loading groceries. Linda stood up now, brushing ash from her hands, her movements cautious but still controlled. She lifted one piece and set it aside, then watched the remaining logs more carefully. Another small pop echoed, not dangerous, just unexpected, and she stepped back slightly, her earlier confidence replaced by curiosity. I watched the scene unfold without moving, the camera still recording, the entire sequence captured from the first flicker to her reaction. She looked around briefly, as if wondering whether anyone else had noticed, then bent closer to inspect the wood, turning one piece with the tongs. The flames settled again, quiet and steady, but the moment had already shifted. She picked up her phone, likely sending another message, then stepped away from the fire pit entirely, leaving the remaining pieces to burn down naturally. The smoke drifted upward in thin wisps, and the neighborhood resumed its routine sounds, but the tension lingered in her posture as she paced once across the patio. I remained on the porch, calm, letting the moment pass without comment. The footage on my phone showed the entire progression clearly, her approach, the stolen logs, the ignition, the unexpected reactions, and her cautious retreat. She had not rushed. She had not panicked. She had simply realized something was different. That realization was enough. She gathered the remaining and used pieces and stacked them to the side, no longer feeding the fire, then went inside, leaving the pit to fade on its own. The yard grew quiet again, the smoke thinning until it disappeared entirely, and I looked back at the woodpile behind me, now nearly empty, knowing the routine that had repeated all week had finally changed, not because I said anything, but because she had experienced something she could not immediately explain. The patio stayed quiet for the rest of the morning, the fire pit cooling into gray ash while Linda moved more cautiously than I had ever seen, glancing at the stacked pieces she had set aside as if they had suddenly become unfamiliar. I did not step outside right away. Instead, I reviewed the full timeline again, watching the sequence from the first missing log to the final moment she backed away from the fire. The clips lined up perfectly, each morning flowing into the next, her routine clear, deliberate, and repeated enough to remove any doubt. By late afternoon, the neighborhood returned to normal, lawn mowers buzzing, kids riding bikes along the curb, and the faint smell of charcoal drifting from another yard. Linda came back out briefly, lifted one of the unused pieces, then hesitated and set it back down without lighting anything. That single pause told me everything had changed. The confidence that guided her every morning had been replaced by uncertainty. I walked along my fence slowly, checking the remaining stack, now down to just over a row, and began adding fresh logs cut earlier in the week. The sound of wood settling into place echoed softly, and I rebuilt the pile carefully, not hiding it, just restoring order. Across the fence, Linda watched without speaking, her expression neutral but attentive, like she was recalculating something she no longer controlled. The evening light stretched long shadows across both yards, and the subdivision softened into the quiet rhythm of dusk. No golf cart appeared the next morning. The latch stayed closed. The camera recorded nothing but empty gravel and the steady line of the rebuilt stack. I left it untouched for another day, then another, and the pattern never returned. A few days later, a short message appeared in the HOA group thread about respecting property boundaries and maintaining neighborly communication, posted by Linda with a tone noticeably different from her usual directives. I did not respond. I simply continued splitting wood, stacking it neatly, and letting the quiet settle back into the routine I had before any of this started. The fire pit across the fence stayed and used for the rest of the week, and when she finally lit it again, she brought out bundled store-bought wood wrapped in plastic, setting it down carefully, as if to make the source obvious. I watched from my porch, the smell of fresh-cut oak still lingering around my own stack, and realized the entire change had happened without a single argument, without a raised voice, just a shift in certainty. She had believed the supply was hers to take. Now she treated every piece as something she needed to justify. The camera remained mounted under the gutter, quietly recording an empty corner, the fence latch unmoved, the gravel undisturbed. The yard returned to silence, and the winter stack slowly grew again, straight rows under the fading light, the kind of order that does not need to announce itself. Linda no longer looked over the fence when I added new pieces, and the morning hum never returned. The only sound left was the steady thud of the splitter and the quiet confidence that comes when a pattern ends without needing another word.